This is Sarah Mansfield, and you are listening to the Below the Surface podcast.
Well, there you go. How did you like that? Nobody better tell us that we don't have a fitting intro to our podcast. So as you just heard, on this episode, we're talking to Sarah Mansfield. Sarah is a very experienced and in our industry, well-known and highly respected environmental lawyer. She works at Norton Rose Fulbright. Aside from being a high-flying lawyer, Sarah was also a director of ALGA for 4 years, ALGA being the Australian Land and Groundwater Association. She's a regular presenter at ALGA events, and because she has so much extra time, she's also the mother of 2 rather young children. She just returned from maternity leave in January when James managed to book her for this interview. As many of you probably know, the chief scientist and engineer has released a paper on the subject of asbestos in waste and in soils in general. It is a 100+ pages paper. It is a tough read, but good news is Sarah has done the work for us and she has written an excellent summary of the key points and what it could mean for our industry legally. At Norton Rose Fulbright, Sarah worked very closely with Elizabeth Wild, who many listeners will remember from our episode a few weeks ago called The Duty to Report. Liz Wild has in the meantime moved on, and we jump into the conversation with Sarah at a point when she tells us a little bit about her life. So we give you the ever so busy, ever so productive, ever so knowledgeable, and always pleasant Sarah Mansfield.
I was on maternity leave until January.
Is that your first baby, Sarah?
Second.
Second. Oh, well,
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank
So
you.
just back for a couple of months.
Yeah, the second one would be so much easier if you didn't have the first already.
I hear that.
No, but things are going well. They're 3.5 and 18 months old. So
Yeah. Oh, nice.
I may have been awake between midnight and 3:30 last night, so I think I'm doing pretty good.
I was actually the same, so I feel you there. I mean, yeah, the struggle is real, so good on you. Like, I don't know what it is. I don't know how we do it, like parents of young kids, but yeah, you figure out a way to work with less sleep than you thought was humanly possible. So good on you.
I find it easier being back at work. I describe it like when you're doing full-time parenting, it's like you're working one particular muscle all the time.
Yeah.
Whereas now you're like, you spread it around a bit.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you can use full sentences.
Yeah, I can use full sentences. It's not putting a little shape through a little plastic thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like we're in the Ukraine. It's hard, but it's not complicated. It's just hard.
That's it. And generally less tantrums at work. It depends which clients we're dealing with, but
The liberty of going out to be able to get a coffee and actually like eat your own food and things like that is quite nice.
yeah, I feel that.
Yeah, not have someone sitting on your lap all the time.
You got any lawyer jokes? Liz was refusing.
Oh, refusing lawyer joke.
Oh yes, she was blatantly supported by James, who I can understand because his wife Dee is a lawyer, so I didn't want to get him too much trouble. But go ahead. You got one?
No, I don't have a lawyer jokes, but why did the banana go to the doctor?
Why?
It was peeling bad.
Oh,
Is that the worst joke you've ever heard?
Oh, that's a dad joke. I should have made that.
So if you put a lawyer on the spot, that's what happens. But well, let's see if one comes to me during the course of the podcast. We're a very serious profession.
Gunnar, we're going to get people asking us, tell us your best engineer joke or something. They're going to be putting it back onto us soon.
oh yeah, they're all right. That's okay.
No one wants to hear that.
You know that one for sure. Where the guy says, "Hey, I am not gonna answer any more questions without a lawyer present." The policeman says, "Well, you are a lawyer." He says, "Exactly. Where's my present?"
So that's very good.
Thank you. I thought so. I had that even for Liz, but she didn't let me tell it. So
Oh, never mind. So what's been keeping you busy other than this delightful podcast?
oh gosh, James, I'm not the one who is super busy. You are.
Where do we start? I think it's me. I think I'm the bottleneck. I'm always the bottleneck
Oh, yeah.
at Four Pillars. As much as I try not to be, but I don't know. It's been a busy start to the year, and I think that my observation is that a lot of stuff that was on hold last year is starting to get going again.
Yeah.
Like it seems to be, I don't know if it's just as simple as being related to, some interest rate relief or what, if it's more than that. But there's just a bit more confidence out there. I think people are willing to go ahead with pulling the trigger on approvals and that sort of thing. So a bit more action in contam land and a few projects like council projects getting going. So I don't know, just seems to be a bit more confidence out there.
Yeah, the vibe is good. I think it's also just it's March. The first couple of months, people, are a bit slower, and now the year's back on, and people are wanting to do stuff.
Yeah.
I've definitely noticed a pickup as well since March. So
yeah,
happy days.
We've been doing this for a little while, but I think we're only really just now, 8 years in, starting to get a feel for what the real seasonality is within the industry, and just being able to predict it a bit better. So yeah, it's nice. It's nice to be really busy. It's a good problem to have.
Look, there's only one thing certain, is that it's not going to work out how you planned it. So times of trying to work out a seasonality, don't bother. Things happen. There's too many factors. It's, the economy, it's EPA resourcing, it's, whether there's a particular, things bespoke to clients. There's no rhyme or reason. Yeah. So there you go.
So Sarah, you have written an excellent article on
Glad you enjoyed it.
The chief scientist of New South Wales has released a position paper, or I don't know what you call it, a paper on asbestos in soils, asbestos in waste.
Yep.
And you've written a really fantastic summary, which I again must say it's excellent. In particular, it is excellent because it comes from a lawyer and not a technical person. The insight that you have in picking out of this, it's a 100-page document, but picking out the salient points was just awesome. And I would like to go through that paper with you and what it means from a legal point of view, and maybe James and I can throw in our technical stuff. So the first point that you say, that the chief scientist considers that the current regulation of asbestos in waste needs to change. This is and I read this, I'm like, well, really? No kidding. It's like, is there anyone out there who thinks it's all what we're doing currently is all okay? In fact,
is wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, our podcast is a direct result of all the nonsense that went on with the Mulchgate, with the asbestos in mulch. There was a direct result where James and I said, we got to say something.
Yeah.
I read your first point that you make there in your paper. So the chief scientist is critical of the zero tolerance approach in New South Wales. It considers that asbestos risk is not, adequately captured in the concept of zero tolerance. James, I'm not going to explain zero tolerance because I'm going to go off the rocker again. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, I can give a technical point of view, and then Sarah, maybe I can throw to you for the sort of the legal origins of this and what it means in practice for us. Because from a technical point of view, the reason why Gunnar and I and some others keep going on and on about the fact that zero tolerance is not achievable, the reason we say that is because asbestos is such a widespread and ubiquitous contaminant, especially in urban environments, that it is unavoidable. And, we know based on Safe Work publications that the air around us in the rooms that we are in right now contain a level of asbestos fibers that is above zero. Yeah. So Gunnar and I always joke around that, if we're asked to prepare a venom certificate, virgin excavated natural material, which is meant to be just virgin and cannot contain asbestos by definition, we joke around by saying that every time we sign off on a venom certificate, technically we're breaking the law because the air around that soil pile has asbestos in it, and therefore there are fibers in that material. We just can't detect them, right?
Yeah. They're asking you to say that something's perfect and nothing is perfect.
And that's where we're coming from. Like we're certainly not promoting asbestos being in recovered materials at levels that are not acceptable. However, we are saying that the concept of zero in this case is not achievable. So that's the technical side. But Sarah, maybe you can give us the sort of the legal background and that sort of things.
Yeah. And I think it was Gunnar who said in another podcast episode, and perhaps the one with Liz about the duty to report, that it's an example of an environmental law that's impossible to comply with.
Yeah.
And that is a very beautiful turn of phrase, and it is exactly correct. So I think it was in about 2018, the first Graffel decision came down with Justice Payne, and that was about, there are a lot of issues in that decision, but one of them was when the definition of asbestos waste is waste containing asbestos, what does that actually mean? And Justice Payne, in her first instance decision, tried to say, well, we've got to take a little bit of a pragmatic, real-life view because otherwise we're going to end up with an absurd result. And
Perfect.
Then the court of...
Perfect. And I read her ruling. It was a thing of beauty. That ruling was awesome.
It was, but it was completely impermissible. And the Court of Appeal confirmed that because she went and created her own law. And that's, the legislation says one thing and she doesn't like what the legislation says, but it's not up to a judge to rewrite the law. They have to interpret it as it is. I mean, and look, that's, a theme amongst the legal profession. You have to be objective and disinterested in the outcome, got to be impartial. And so she sort of read into the act words that just simply weren't there. And that created a problem. And ultimately her decision was overturned by the Court of Appeal. And we are left with this conundrum where we have an environmental law which is acknowledged as being basically impossible to comply with. And the EPA is aware of this. And then you also have the issues, well, no amount of asbestos is permitted in waste, but the contaminated land and the NEPM, does allow an amount of asbestos. And the thing that really gets to me is you have this idea that no amount of asbestos can be in waste. But what constitutes waste is largely determined by subjective criteria. So the intentions and the state of mind of the person who owns the waste. It's not dependent on any objective criteria like the risk profile of the material or what it contains, contaminant concentrations.
Yeah.
So not risk-based criteria, but just what the person proposes, whether they have a beneficial use for the material. And that isn't a logical way of controlling risk or protecting the environment. And these are well-known issues, and we are slowly getting to a place where the legislation is going to have to be amended.
Yeah.
But the question is, in what kind of time frame, and what do we do during this, we'll call it a transition period. And the law is the law as it is today. We have, the Wilkinson report, which was saying we need, amongst other things, we need to look at zero tolerance to asbestos waste. We have the EPA position paper, which says, yes, in principle, we agree. We're going to get the Office of Chief Scientist to do an independent report on this issue. And now we have the Office of Chief Scientist's report saying, yes, the zero tolerance approach to asbestos waste needs to come to an end. It is counterproductive. It's not, achieving its objective. It's putting undue pressure on particular people or entities in the system who are probably not best placed to deal with it. We need to change it. But the law is what it is today. So what does it mean for its enforcement in the meantime?
Well, that's right. And it's probably worth noting there that as far as I'm aware, I've checked all the sources I can, the EPA's response to the Chief Scientist's paper has not been released yet.
No, it hasn't.
We were expecting that a little while ago. I think there was, I mentioned on a previous pod, there was an event, I think on the 11th of March, where the CEO of the EPA had flagged that they were going to speak about the response, but that got pushed. I think it's been delayed. So we still haven't seen that response yet.
No, but what I can say is when Liz and I did our podcast, we did interview Tony Chappell on this point, and he certainly indicated that zero tolerance, I won't put words in his mouth, but the vibe was, we will be looking at zero tolerance, and it would be difficult for the EPA to leave things as they are in face of the Office of Chief Scientist's report. But the issue with it for them is it's not just a matter of changing the legislation. And if someone wanted to ask me how I would change it, I would happily oblige. But there's a whole bunch of other things that need to happen that are going to take time. New guidelines, the sampling criteria, someone smarter than me is going to have to figure out what that's supposed to look like. And the training, the broader system needs to change. I co-presented with the Office of Chief Scientists a few weeks ago, and they spoke about the Swiss cheese model, is that you need to know all of the controls together. But then there's this tension of, well, do we wait for perfect, or do we do something now to address it? Because if we wait for perfect, for everything to be lined up, we're going to be, are we cutting off our nose to spite our face? Because there's problems in the system today. And so I think these are complicated issues. There are a lot of stakeholders. Some people are very happy with this report. Others are not. Others are, there's a lot of fear and concern around asbestos, and I don't think anyone can be critical for that. So they have multiple stakeholders, and
there's a lot to be said about all of this. The first thing I want to mention is that it's not only there's a lot of pressure on stakeholders, including us as environmental consultants. Again, any waste classification report I sign that is not classifying material as asbestos waste is, strictly speaking, illegal and breaking the law, which doesn't sit well with me. And we have a law, and then it's not enforced. That's just not good enough for.
Or is it not enforced? This is the thing. You've got a law that is impossible to comply with. So there's compliance issues across a range of clients. And then sometimes clients will have to respond to an investigation, or will have penalty notices, and they're like, hey, why me?
Yeah.
Other people are in a similar position and they don't seem to be being pursued. And that's really hard. That's
the risk, isn't it?
That's a risk, even if the EPA, and I'm sure they do, have good grounds for pursuing particular individuals. It's really hard when you've got a law that's universally not being complied with, and then how do you choose who you enforce it against in a fair and justified manner? Yeah,
it creates a lot of concern, like particularly for people like me who are actually running firms in this space, and who are ultimately, I say this all the time, ultimately it's me who's responsible for everything that we produce as a business. And so it worries me sometimes when you think that it just takes one person to decide, I think I'm going to enforce this to the letter of what we're allowed to do. We'd rather just fix it.
Well, I think that would be interesting because the EPA has a very clear compliance and enforcement policies. And they talk about level of culpability, whether it's intentional degree of harm. And I think there's a lot of good content in the Office of Chief Scientist report, which would help you to say, under your own policy, you should exercise your discretion not to pursue me.
I totally agree with you. And this is like it's a very fringe issue, like it's a fringe risk really, but and unlikely that anything ever would be pursued in that space. I think there's some ultra conservatism that's coming into, like, particularly the environmental consulting space, just because the EPA, especially with the new powers that they have to sort of announce investigations before anything has come of them and that sort of thing, it's really putting the consulting sector on notice. I think be absolutely squeaky clean, because even if you are being looked into, that can be put out in the public sphere and affect your reputation. So but
even that, EPA investigations to one side, right? If you're got a waste classification certificate and then someone takes material to a waste facility and they're like, we can't accept this because it's got asbestos in it, your client is then incurring additional costs and delay. So it's that civil liability issue as well. It's that misleading or deceptive conduct claim. And, often the greatest financial costs associated with contaminated land aren't, the criminal side of things. It's actually that civil liability thing, which is why, they're not perfect, but limitations in reports, making sure your reports are really clear, terms and conditions, all of that stuff is important as well to protect you as much as you can. But no one wants to issue a venom certificate, which at the bottom of it says may still contain asbestos, because that's not a that's not a venom.
I say it a little bit more elegantly than that. Ultimately, look, the bottom line is, it seems to be heading, at least in that regard, we seem to be heading in the right direction, that we say we can't have a law like this that an entire industry cannot comply with, and then selective poor bastards get picked out, Phil being one of them, and get taken to the cleaners. I haven't heard of an environmental consultant yet who got into trouble for writing a waste classification report for general solid waste and did everything right. And then someone comes along and says, hey,
yeah,
you realize that there must have been some fibers in it, so he was wrong. And then the EPA with full force came after them. I haven't heard that, but the possibility is there. And that is what's so unacceptable for me.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I meant with, again, it's not enforced, because there is a law, we can't comply with it. Can we please change it? It was 2018, it's now 2025. How long can we have in a Western society where we hold up the law as much as we can and we respect the law? How long can we have this nonsense happening?
But also it's becoming to the way, and the Office of Chief Scientist makes some comments around this. It ends up being up to the waste facilities to enforce it, and that puts them in a very difficult position. And like, we've all been to waste facilities, the poor people at the gate, like, it's a completely imperfect process, and then you've got the person with the truck, their load's being sent away, they've got their own pressures. It's the people least able to deal with it who are really having to bear the brunt of it, and that's and that's difficult. And then the incentives for disposing of material unlawfully keep building because they're in this crunch.
Yeah.
Look, I need to add one more thing. There's also and just the harm that this Graphil case and this strict interpretation of the zero tolerance approach, the harm it has caused to the environment is unbelievable, because we're filling up rather precious landfill space with clean material. We have to take material that would be perfectly suitable to be placed in a childcare center and build on top of it. But no, that is considered asbestos waste, and we have to take it to a special waste facility. That is a terrible, terrible thing.
It's a failure of environmental law. I don't think you can blame the court, though. I think the words in the PoEO Act were clear. I think it's the PoEO Act.
It is. There's no question about that. But it's also the harm to the environment and the sustainability that we are all after is just gone out the window.
Yeah.
Andrew Doigan in episode 13, the train wreck, had such a great explanation for it. It's like, we are running out of landfill space, so let's stop filling it up with clean stuff.
Yeah, because there are ways of being able to reuse material excavated on site that may contain the amounts of asbestos, but a site auditor, is comfortable for it to remain on site. But you have to put in a lot of, you have to put a strategy around it and a lot of documentation to make sure that material isn't characterized as waste.
Yeah.
And that feels often like you're doing something that you shouldn't be able to do. But because the definition of waste is related to the subjective intention of the person, it is an option available to you, because you can have a particular intention, and so long as you can prove it, because the ban is on asbestos waste. If the material doesn't constitute waste, then those provisions of the PoEO Act do not apply. So,
all right, next point.
Yes,
Sarah. So the chief scientist recommends that the EPA improves existing and develops new guidelines for implementing the proposed concentration thresholds. So, one step back. So instead of the zero tolerance, the chief scientist has proposed that we are allowed to have certain concentrations of asbestos in waste. Okay. The concentrations that they propose, in this case, the proposal is 0.001%, so 0.001%, which is exactly on the level of reporting of the methods used. These levels of reporting are already rather, how should I say, there's a lot of people who say we can't go that low scientifically.
Yeah.
So we are reporting on detection limits and not on levels of reporting. So there's a difference. Sorry, let me explain. The level of reporting is a laboratory can report justifiably and accountably for that kind of level. Then there is a method detection limit, or a limit of detection, where under ideal circumstances you may be able to get lower than that. But reporting under the level of reporting is generally not acceptable in science. It's just not, because you're fishing in a hazy area. But these 0.001 percentages are below the level of reporting of the standards that we use. So me as a scientifically minded person, I have already got a problem with this. Okay? Aside from the fact that there is no supporting literature out there that actually correlate a risk to those kind of low, very
still an arbitrary figure.
I can tell you where it comes from. It
comes from WA.
By the way, I have the next guest we have already is someone who was on the panel to develop those, and I can't wait to hear how that actually happened.
To develop the new Australian standard.
New standard. Yes. So look, bottom line, we will have a certain amount of asbestos, which is way higher, by the way, than what is allowed to be under the National Environmental Protection Measure for land use suitability. But we will have some thresholds. Okay.
Yes.
So that's a big change. That is a big change, and you already mentioned that will probably trigger a change in the PoEO Act. Is that right?
Yes, it will have to. Yes.
Okay. Good. Finally, yes. We're on the right track here.
So what's your take on the threshold, Sarah? Like how do you see that being implemented in practically?
Well, there's a lot of amendments proposed to the PoEO Act, and I don't know the Wilkinson report pursuant to which the EPA have obtained the Office of Chief Scientist
and just
report.
that was at the Resource Recovery Framework.
Yes, review.
Right, that's the Wilkinson
So she talks
report.
about a lot of things. So she talks about potentially bringing an end to when material constitutes waste. So end of waste criteria, because at the moment, once a material is waste, it's always waste.
Yeah.
And so then it's always subject to the PoEO Act. And she's like, well, certain material, if it's being meets a criteria and it's being reused out in the world, do we still want to call it waste, for example, is one of her other proposed reforms. And so whether or not the EPA does a wholesale review of the PoEO Act, or whether they chip away and try and implement some of these reforms faster is to be seen. But I think the Office of Chief Scientist is saying, yes, this threshold is one part of the puzzle, but the whole bunch of other stuff needs to happen. If you wanted to do something faster, you could look at going, okay, on an ad hoc basis, would we grant an order and exemption in these specific circumstances before all the guidelines and the training and the wholesale amendments to the PoEO Act? That would be one way to speed things up, but that would lead to a lot of ad hoc requests to the EPA for orders and exemptions. And I note the proposed amendments to that framework. There's a consultation papers out at the moment.
Yeah,
but that's just one pipeline idea of how you could do something a bit more quickly. But again, that would need a lot of resourcing. This is the thing. But I'd suggest that these transition periods are really hard. Because you can't, they're in a position where they've got a report saying the current standard and law is counterproductive and impossible to comply with. The faster this gets resolved, the better for the industry and the better for the EPA.
And it's been only 5 years. What the hell? 7.
Can I just mention something as well, that it sort of it relates to both the zero tolerance and this threshold that we're talking about, where, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the issues that that we also had was that the standard for manufactured materials to be considered free of asbestos and therefore able to be sold in Australia. My understanding was that the reporting limit of the analysis method was the benchmark, right? So effectively you had a threshold on new products being sold into Australia. And it seemed, and the zero tolerance also created an issue where, like, you can have something on the shelf that contains more than 0 of asbestos so long as it's below the threshold, but you can't then reuse that material in
technically speaking.
And I know it's a very similar issue with PFAS related stuff, is that we've got these ultra low PFAS thresholds for recovered materials and for NEPM levels and human health levels, but there's PFAS present in so many consumer goods that we use at levels way above that. So it was the same disconnect, I think, with asbestos, that at least we're now kind of addressing that disconnect, which is good.
Yeah, but on the PFAS point, and I realize we're going totally off topic, but I've listened to you guys and you seem pretty cool with that. Is, you through the ICAMS regime, you have bans on material being imported and exported into the country that contain PFAS other than unintentional trace concentrations. And I think that there are a range of importers and exporters who might not be aware of those upcoming changes and have PFAS in their products, and how that's going to be enforced and implemented. It will be interesting to see.
I need to get my head around that. I've got to admit, the ICAMS changes are something I'm not familiar with. So
that's all right. I've got something I can send you, James.
We need to do a pod on that in the future.
While we're talking nonsense, by the way, in PFAS, I just learned that Queensland has a zero tolerance for PFAS in waste. The moment you have any detection, and you know how low we can go on PFAS, right?
Yeah.
The moment you have, it immediately becomes category 1 waste, which is the highest contaminated material to deal with.
Wow.
Yeah, but supposedly it's under review. And like, really, who comes up with the idea to have a zero limit? Yeah. That has to be a politician, because it sounds so good.
Yeah.
It's such nonsense. Anyhow, let's go back to...
But let's not be negative Nancy's. This is what we live for, guys. If this stuff was easy, what would we do?
That's a good point. That's a good point, actually.
I was going to say, Sarah, I mean, a lot of our work is around asbestos and the complexities of managing asbestos and remediation and waste. And I imagine a lot of your work is the same. I mean, I'm sure we're going to just shift onto other issues, but like theoretically, we won't have to work on as much asbestos stuff anymore.
Well, this is the thing. Asbestos is everywhere, and I'm sure from your guys' perspective, it's quite a boring contaminant. It's inert.
It's pretty common,
until it's I guess blown up into the air. But it's it's still an issue.
It's one of those things where like it's easy. We deal with it so much, and it is it comes up on literally every single site assessment we do. Basically, like. That it's a bit easy to get complacent about it as well, but it's such a complex area. That's why Gunnar and I keep coming back to it, in this pod and just in our day-to-day work, is because it's easy to fall into the trap of being like, yeah, I know how to deal with this issue, but it's not that simple, and it's constantly
not to
changing.
be underestimated.
Yeah,
asbestos,
for sure.
And here it comes, perfect segue. Next point, Sarah, in your paper. The chief scientist recommends that the New South Wales government develop national competency-based training. And my comment there is, yes, please. We had Pirina Otnes from Western Australia on this podcast, and we spoke about how difficult it is to do a really well-done asbestos in soil assessment. The training for it is very, very hard to come by. In fact, there isn't really any. You can read the NEPM. You can get together some. You can read all the safe work guidelines. You can read. It's not easy because there isn't really
anything that ties it all together.
Really, it's such a complicated subject with lots of people having their fingers in there as well, and some of them don't even want their fingers in there. Here, that safe work isn't really that keen on everything that happens with asbestos in soil, and then. And Pirina and I spoke about it. I said, look, Pirina, I find it so hard to become good at this and to become solid and make solid, bang-on decisions. Like, no, this is okay. This amount of asbestos is okay to stay on the site. It is really, really hard. And as I said, there's a lack of training. And she said, well, put a training program together, and she will happily talk. And I'm like, yeah. Because we all have time for that. But the more reports I read, the more I read about asbestos, and the more I get dragged into specialist requirements and specialist remediations involving asbestos, the more I realize there is just a fundamental lack of knowledge in our industry. Yeah. And not only a fundamental lack of knowledge, but also a considerable amount of being scared and fear. Of being caught out by some nuance that you didn't account for. But in that recommendation, please let's develop national competency-based training. Yes, please. Yes. I need it big time.
Yeah. Liz and I actually once worked on a matter where there was an environmental consultant and the junior team were out doing field work, and it turned out later that there was asbestos on site that wasn't identified, and on in further investigation it was because the junior personnel didn't know what it looked like.
I don't know how much I missed.
That's a fault in their training. That's not necessarily a criticism of the individual.
Yeah.
It's hard. We need the classic asbestos fragment, the ACM fragments, and it's can very quickly know how to identify those. But you dig into fill material and you pull all sorts of stuff out of there.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's fibrous, sometimes it's ropes, sometimes it looks like a bird's nest, and sometimes it is so hard to get around that. And no matter how often you read Section 4 in the NEPM, you ain't gonna get good at it.
Well, it's based on experience, right? And the fact is, the more junior people are doing the field work.
Yeah. It's funny, like it's actually a good segue into another part of the paper that wasn't really a focus it wasn't a focus in anyone's commentary really, and it didn't something that you mentioned in your paper, Sarah, but it was the stuff, kind of the addendums to the paper that we're talking about, detection technologies and that sort of thing, and it was particularly interest for us. I mean, we're right into that sort of stuff about like how do we improve detection in the field, because like you just said, like we're really reliant on using our own eyes, visual detection, and making a decision in the field. And there's that thing where it's like, if you're uncertain about anything, well, you have to err on the side of caution and get it tested at the laboratory, which is fine to say in theory. But like Gunnar said, if you're going through fill and there's some foreign material in there, and you might have 10 or 15 different kind of types of foreign material you can identify, and you might have some uncertainty about it, $1,500 right there to get that analyzed at the laboratory. And it's like the cost can very quickly add up. And so, I'm really keen. That paper was, kind of didn't really give much cred, I guess, to most technology that's available at the moment. But like, it's an area that I really hope the EPA and others will invest some money into.
Well, I think there's grants mentioned in the paper. And I think if anyone's looking for a side hustle or otherwise want to invest in this area, I think we need real life practical, solutions. No amount of legislative redrafting is going to do the industry as much good as a good practical solution.
Well, that's it. And interestingly, people might know this already, but the microphaser AS, which is one of the more widespread tools that were being used in Australia, at least, has been discontinued by Thermo Fisher, by its manufacturer. And a part of that was that it just simply, even though it's not a perfect instrument by any means, however, it did add value when used in the right way. It just never got any traction with regulators. And Thermo just, it wasn't commercially viable for them anymore. So they pulled the pin. Like, the technology had potential, but it just wasn't getting enough traction. So it's just one of those things where, like you said before, let's not let perfect get in the way of good. And I feel like we need to accept the evolution of this technology is going to require us to accept that there is imperfections in some of them, but still to use them
But they have to get off the ground, and there has to be a market for them, and then they'll be improved.
Well, that's it. Otherwise, there's no incentive for the manufacturers to keep pushing and keep researching and make the next better version of it. So it's something for everyone to keep in mind, I think.
We're slowly reaching the end of our time slot. Can I try and summarize? I think finally something is moving in that area that needed to be addressed badly. I think that's a key takeaway from that paper. Things seem to be, at least there's something happening, which is great.
There's cause to be optimistic.
Yes. I'm not so optimistic about applying methods where you ask labs to report below the reporting limit. That just, I can't believe this chief scientist actually says that, which leads me to the next point, where I think that these new thresholds that are recommended, to me at least, they seem to be more politically based than based on, say, research, actual risk, or God forbid, the environment, or the sustainability needs that we have. We're not changing much. We are now changing it that you can have a certain amount. We acknowledge that you can't go to zero. We acknowledge that, but there will be the same amount of unnecessary asbestos waste or waste that is classified as asbestos waste going to landfills. So where did the sustainability goals that the New South Wales government has, where did they go? That's the summary. Sarah.
Yes, I agree what you're saying. My take on the report was slightly different, which was that no one can come up with a number that's safe for asbestos in all circumstances. And this is where I think we need to flick into there's long been a disconnect between the waste regime and the contaminated land regime. And this is where I think you have to empower site auditors to say, this material in this context with these protections, then I'm satisfied, which brings us to my next favorite topic and area for reform is the enforcement and notification of EMPs. But, I think that's part of the piece, coming up with a single threshold where you can say it's safe at all contexts that is going to be inherently conservative. And, I'll let the Office of Chief Scientist, who I'm hoping is going to speak at an ALGA event in Sydney shortly, talk about the criteria. But it is, they're saying some threshold is better than zero because it enables some flexibility in the regime. And, I think it's based on the WA guidelines. And so there was a bit of a precedence for that. Whether or not that threshold is appropriate or still too low, I leave that to the technical experts. But what would be really great to see is that we have an amazing regime of using site auditors. It is relatively national. No, it's not completely consistent, but there's definitely the bones of it there, empowering the site auditors to say this material, regardless of whether or not it is waste, can be suitably used on site in this way. And that site-specific risk-based criteria, I think many people would be an advocate for that.
Well, we have that.
We have that, but they still, at the moment, they can't let the material be reused if it's asbestos based.
Okay. Well, that's correct. Yes.
I know you can't talk about, individual matters or anything like that, but do you think that this paper will help maybe some of the things that are currently on foot where, you might have people who have got issues, they're in regulatory strife around asbestos. Like, will this change the way that that's looked at, in terms of those legal matters? Like,
I think there's someone using best endeavours or using best practice, and nevertheless there's asbestos there. I think it will absolutely help those people if they are in fact attracting regulatory attention. People who are not using all reasonable endeavours and would be, I don't think this will be an excuse for to all kinds of conducts, but those who would be caught by the strict compliance issue despite doing everything that they could reasonably be expected to do. I think this is helpful. And there was a relatively recent case, Muscat and Wollondilly Shire Council, where they Commissioner of the Land and Environment Court initially said, I can't allow a development consent permit, which involves the reuse of asbestos waste because that's illegal under the PoEO Act. And the Chief Judge said, no, actually you can. When you're exercising a planning function, you put your EPA Act blinkers on, or the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act blinkers on, and if it can be approved under that criteria, then it can be approved. That doesn't stop it from being a breach of the PoEO Act, but council, it doesn't preclude you from approving it. And so I think that case, in the context of what the Office of Chief Scientist is saying, is certainly interesting. But in terms of giving a boost to the industry, if we do get to a place where we can appropriately reuse material containing asbestos on site and stopping such exorbitant off-site disposal costs, I think that would be practically very helpful, because construction and remediation will become cheaper. And wouldn't that be lovely?
Going back to what we were talking about before about zero tolerance and how it's not possible, the advice, like you just said, when we get clients coming to us, the advice that we can give is like, sure, it's not achievable, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't make your absolute best attempts to comply with it. And it's like you said, I think like that, to being able to demonstrate that you've done everything you possibly could, if there is something that goes wrong, it just gives you that ammunition to say, like, what more could we have possibly done in this situation?
A key concept in environmental law is this idea of all due diligence.
Yeah.
So exercise all else fails, exercise all due diligence, and it'll help you out every time.
There's another concept in environment, never go to court. There's another concept.
Oh, every now and then it's necessary.
Yeah.
Hey, Sarah, thank you so much for coming.
Oh, that was so much fun. That time went very quickly. Anytime.
Oh, thanks, Sarah.
Another thank you for what you're doing at ALGA.
Ah.
You are very busy, and anyone who supports ALGA like you do needs to be commended. I learn a lot from your webinars. They are fantastic.
They're a pleasure to give, and it's one of the great things about being an environmental lawyer. You're not just talking from other lawyers. Like, the amount that I have learned over the years from working with consultants, it's what makes it fun, because you learn things along the way, and then it doesn't get boring, and you have a whole other set of colleagues who you work with and genuinely collaborate with, and that is, not everyone has that, and that just makes life more enjoyable, and it means, you give legal solutions that can actually be implemented, hopefully, and that's a win. All right, guys, that have been delightful. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.